Welcome, everyone, to our Technology Earth webinar series here at Triple Ring Technologies. I'm Sheila Hamami. I lead the Environment and Sustainability Business Unit in Triple Ring's Boston office, and I'm speaking to you today from Boston. Triple Ring's longstanding mission is to improve human health through innovative technologies, and we all now recognize that human health is completely intertwined with having a healthy planet. So applying our capabilities to a healthy planet is a natural extension of our mission. The Technology Earth webinar series is a natural expansion for us. In this series, we convene world experts and technologists working on a variety of environmental challenges to frame the problems and the challenges of scale up and to discuss viable solutions. Our goal is to connect individuals working in these problem spaces with the innovation ecosystem that has so successfully delivered life-changing solutions in the biotech space. So I'm very glad that you're all joining us today. Before we start, let me mention some logistics about the webinar. So please pose your questions in the Q&A box. Questions will be moderated. We'll take maybe a few questions after each speaker, but generally go through the questions at the end, and we'll open things up to the whole panel at the end. Today, our topic is ecology and autonomy, from drones to decision-making, and we have an intercontinental panel of experts who are joining us. We will learn about the current state of the art in autonomous data gathering and decision-making, and we'll hear about two exciting and impressive applications thereof. Today's panel comprises 3 speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Nisar Ahmed, professor of Aerospace Engineering Sciences at the University of Colorado. Nisar will describe some current approaches to large-scale autonomous data gathering and example uses in a range of environmental applications. Now, his work has been supported by DARPA, the U.S. Department of Defense, NASA, and multiple industry sponsors. He's an internationally recognized scholar for his work on autonomous robotics, sensor fusion, and human-machine interaction. And he is the site director of the National Science Foundation-funded Center for Aerial Autonomy, Mobility, and Sensing. Our second speaker today is Dr. Brad Hanson, who is a wildlife biologist at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that's NOAA, Northwest Fisheries Science Center. He will showcase a drone-based approach to monitoring the health of wild orcas in the San Juan Islands in Washington State. And this is a very challenging application from a variety of angles, and he's going to tell us more about what they're doing, how they're doing it, and he'll discuss some open challenges. Very, very neat and interesting application. And our third speaker, joining us from Australia today now, is Dr. Debbie Saunders, CEO and founder of Wildlife Drones. So Debbie's going to describe her company's solution and platform for biodiversity monitoring in support of conservation policy. She holds a PhD in conservation ecology, and she founded Wildlife Drones in 2016 out of a need for new solutions in her ecological research at the time. Now, the company has won a variety of innovation and conservation awards and has a range of solutions that work in extremely impressive deployment conditions. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Nisar, who's going to kick us off with an overview of the problem space.
Thanks, Sheila. Appreciate the intro. Let me just share my screen. Okay, is it coming through okay? Looks okay, great. Awesome. So thanks, and thanks for joining and for the invite. So Sheila asked me to give a rundown of some state-of-the-art and ways that drones are being used in applications for information gathering and so forth. So I'll dive right in. I will do this from the perspective of research that I've encountered since I've been at CU for about 10 years. And my background is in robotics, and I kind of fell into the drone and aircraft space. And so I'm going to share some of the things mostly that my colleagues are doing and things more recently that I've been doing as well. But let me go ahead and dive in. So I just want to introduce my colleagues first, and they were gracious enough to let me use all their cool videos for storm chasing and all the fun stuff that I'm going to show you. So this is Brian Argro, Eric Frew, Dale Lawrence, Morteza Lajani, and Zach Sundberg. These are the labs that we all are part of, and we're part of something called the Research and Engineering Center for Uncrewed Vehicles, or RECOV. And I'm going to describe some of the work that established RECOV and made it a name in the sort of drone space. So with that, but before I do that, I remember Sheila asked me to give as a brief history of drones. So I'm going to give the most rapid pictorial history of drones that you'll find on the web. When I was a grad student at Cornell in 2006, this is what drones look like back then. So this is Professor Raf D'Andrea, who's now at ETH Zurich. He had a student, Oliver Perwin, whose job it was to make this thing fly autonomously. This is before GPS receivers were, could fit on your cell phone, and this is before we had really good IMUs and flight controllers and all this other stuff. So these propellers are over a foot long. This thing flew indoors only, was not allowed to fly outside. And if you were going to fly it, you needed a riot shield to protect yourself from whatever it was going to do. So only the experts could fly this type of thing, and it was not considered safe, and very robust. And nowadays, fast forward to 2024, now that I have my own students, I've tasked them with building drones. I have 3 teams that are building drones, and it only took them a month to do it. Okay, so, and they fly outside. They've been certified to fly under FAA COAs. I have a mission for them where they have to track other robots and stuff. So what they can do is just go off the shelf to Amazon and buy a flight computer that works really well. They can buy a CPU to go inside there that can do all sorts of vision processing and autonomous calculations. They can throw a GPU on there if they want to. They can also use this thing called the Cube Black, which is a really cool flight controller that can even auto-tune while it's flying. So you don't even really have a good model of your drone, unlike this thing, where that was the whole research problem, was to figure out what that model was and how to deal with it if it broke. And you can program everything in Arducopter. You could throw a GPS receiver on there for $50. You can go into ROS and download all the packages. So it's nice and easy. And so these seniors had never ever built a drone before, and they had never programmed in ROS before, and they had no knowledge of any of this stuff when I started working with them in September. And in that short amount of time, they were able to do this. And this was a video they took last week, right before the giant snowstorm moved in. So we've come a really long way since I've been in 18 years for what you can do with drones now. Okay, so the rest of the talk is really about, what have people done with them in that amount of time. And sort of fittingly enough, the first part of the history I'll give you goes into Recov's deployment for in situ and environmental sensing. So the theme here is ecology and the environment. I think it's fitting. Instead of at the end where we'll talk maybe a bit more about how defense applications have driven a lot of these things, I'll actually start with Recov, where from the beginning they've been doing ecology and the environment with drone deployments, and mostly trying to study difficult to reach parts of the atmosphere, things that are very hard to sense with conventional radar or balloons and things like that, where you actually want to take more controlled measurements and be able to have particular systems with sensors that are tailor-made for the situation, as well as aircraft that are tailor-made, things that don't necessarily fly the way you want to fly when there are people inside the aircraft, but where do you want to take measurement of turbulent atmosphere, you want to kind of go with the turbulence and go with the stream a little bit and fly in unconventional ways with unconventional aircraft. So you can kind of see a smattering of these things. They've been deployed all over the world, from Peru to Antarctica to the Arctic, Japan, all over the place in the Caribbean. So this is around the time I joined Recov. Is early 2014, 2015 is when I started working in this space. So you can see there's already quite a lot of history here from Brian Argro and Dale Lawrence and Eric Frew. I'll show you some of the more recent stuff they've been doing. One of the cooler ones is storm chasing. So you've seen the movie Twister. So this is how they actually do it nowadays. So they, in about May to June timeframe, Brian and Eric like to get in their fancy cars, which can launch drones from them while they're driving 60 miles an hour, and they go look for tornadoes out in the plains in the western United States. And here's a picture of a tornado that was about a mile or 2 miles away that they actually encountered in their last outing last summer. This is the video I was showing you, is the drone not flying towards a tornado, it's actually flying towards the back end of the storm cell that formed the tornado, which is where the meteorologists that they're working with actually want the data. That because they don't understand tornado genesis very well, and so the part of the storm that they want to sample are the difficult to reach parts, and the parts that are difficult to get big radar sensors out to in a moment's notice. But they can drive around Kansas and Nebraska looking for storms, and they can go there and deploy their drones immediately. And they can launch a couple of these at a time. They can launch 3, 4, 5, 6. And you also see these balloons, which they have a fancy name. They're called Lagrangian drifters. They kind of float along with the free stream, taking measurements, and they kind of drift around the storm. And so they have this collection of drones that are targeting observations in certain areas. And The drones are autonomous to the point where they follow designated waypoints and safe areas and paths, and they can actually track the vehicle. So these launch vehicles, as they're driving, the drones can return home and kind of follow along the car, so that makes them easier to recover. So they've been doing this for over a decade now. So this is like the second or third major NSF funded campaign that they've been doing. The drone that they're using is sort of the third or fourth generation drone, actually, in their arsenal of drones. So this is called the Raven. This is what it stands for. Aerospace engineers love a good acronym, so that's what that is. Maybe a tortured acronym, but this is also where it flies, is this rear flank downdraft. So they're trying to avoid things like hail and lightning and rain and heavy winds. And so they need really durable drones. And so this drone is made out of foam. It's a commercial off-the-shelf modified package, but they've settled on this design. They started with things that used to be made out of fiberglass. They were glider models. They were not very stable and not very robust. But with these drones, they can actually put in all of these sensors that you see here. A lot of these are off-the-shelf parts and sort of typical things, but some of these things are custom made, like these pitot tubes and wind probes, which are very important for the atmospheric sensing and measurements. So, and they can downlink telemetry data as well in real time with communication connections. They have a giant chaser van that has a massive antenna on top of it that can broadcast signals to all these drones. And they launch, like I said, multiple of these drones at a time. They also have a new one coming out, which is actually a VTOL model called the Vulture. These are tilt rotors on the front. They actually take off vertically and then go into level flight afterwards. And you notice this drone landing on the left, it's belly landing. There's no landing gear on it. It actually just goes out in the planes, and they can recover it. So they have to launch it by hand or launch it off a catapult, or they try to do this like eVTOL type of thing. So I've been told yesterday that they're actively working on getting this thing flight certified. This was actually a student project, the Vulture, that was designed at CU. So this is where some drone technology is going today to deal with short takeoff and landing kinds of situations. By the way, the movie Twisters, I think it's the sequel to Twister, features this drone actually in the trailer. So you'll see it on the big screen soon. Brian, Argro, and Eric aren't sure whether they're on the good guy team or the bad guy team. So we have to find out when the movie comes out. Hopefully they're on the good guy team. But there it is. There's the Raven in a Hollywood movie. There's also other work related nowadays that, we know how to fly. How do we actually get the drones to do what we want? So this is a big slide from Professor Frew's lab on the kinds of infrastructure that gets built around the actual aircraft. So you have these fixed sites, weather radar, and you even have connections to supercomputers to do weather calculations to model the wind field, to improve the controllability of the drones and to improve the planning ahead of time when the storm comes, because obviously there's a lot of turbulence and chaos up there. You don't want to lose valuable data, but more importantly, you don't want to lose a drone or anybody to get hurt. So trying to predict and forecast ahead of time how to do more sophisticated planning and how to do more sophisticated control and how to coordinate with all these other kinds of things like these balloons to coordinate the data collection. That's a big topic that's now a focus of attention, and also improving the interface to the scientists on the ground who are not necessarily aerospace engineers, but they want to know where they can get the best data as they see the storm unfolding in real time and they see really cool stuff happening. Another professor in our lab, Dale Lawrence, his name got kind of clipped off here, but he's also been doing work separately for upper atmosphere sensing. So he's trying to look at nocturnal boundary layer. This is a campaign from a few years ago where he built these Data Hawk drones. And these are really lightweight hand-launched drones, but they have these cool hot wire probe sensors where they can just keep soaring and flying for hours and hours and hours, taking data way beyond human endurance, right? So a human pilot wouldn't want to necessarily fly these kinds of really boring flight patterns, but they can also get really high up in the atmosphere, and they coordinate with these weather balloons that make it up into the upper atmosphere too, to gather data that's pretty challenging to get otherwise. That's due to radar resolution and radar placement and things like that. He's also involved with this thing called Mosaic, some of you may have heard of, where they froze this icebreaker into the North Atlantic, and they deployed all these drones and robots around this icebreaker to sample what's going on around the ice and the atmosphere and below the water. So Dale and his team designed multi-rotors and some of these Data Hawks to go out there and support the mission. So they have dozens of these things that they've built outside. And so just to wrap up in the few minutes I have left, in a minute or two I have left here, I want to point out that, you know, the title of the talk is also about decision making. So leading into that, some of the other work that we've been doing has been looking at AI and machine learning. So for decision making and understanding. So here's some, you know, general pictures about where we do that with aircraft, but also we've been looking and talking to roboticists and people who do spacecraft science observations as well. So I'm part of a project that's looking at how do we generate science on Europa, one of the icy moons of Jupiter, using the kinds of lessons we've learned from drone technology. So those are some cool projects as well. But to point out some of the things like Professor Frew is doing, I mentioned the sort of real-time control with supercomputers and machine learning to try and figure out how to get fast, precise guidance following complex patterns. A lot of the autopilots that work in drones only follow like fixed waypoints and do loiters, but actually getting to fly a particular trajectory is actually a little trickier because you have to hack into the flight controller. But future generation flight controllers might allow you to do something even more sophisticated to get really precise flight patterns, so you can actually get the kind of data that you really want. And then lastly, there's the science and human in the loop kind of aspect, which my research covers. So I have a PhD student, Hunter, who's shown here, works for the Boulder Emergency Squad. He gets people off the Flatirons when they go up hiking in the summer when they're not supposed to. So he has to use drones to go find out where people are located if they get lost. So for search and rescue, drones are a really valuable tool. The problem is you need multiple people to look at sensor data and then you need a person to pilot. So can you combine the technology in one and still tell the drone what it is you want it to do without having to be, again, an expert in flying the drone? So the drone can fly itself, but can you communicate and be understood by the drone as to what exactly you want it to do and what data you wanted to gather with the sensors that you have available? So that's where the research that we're doing in CAMS that Sheila mentioned, the Center for Autonomy, Mobility, and Sensing, that's being supported by that. And lastly, I'll mention, going back to the defense side of things, this is a project Sheila might have known when she was at Draper. This is a project that kicked off with our Draper scholar at the time, Astar Chaya, who's now at NASA, Ames, doing her postdoc. This is machine self-confidence. Can the drones tell you what they can and can't do? So if you tell it, I want you to go get those pictures and come back here in 10 minutes, okay, well, can it tell you if it can do the job or not? So sort of human level introspection of the task, okay, and understanding the capabilities and the limitations of the sensing and the hardware and translating that back again to users who are not necessarily experts. So the last couple of things I've been talking about are sort of futuristic, researchy things, but hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see some of these capabilities actually show up. So with that, I'll yield the floor and the microphone to my esteemed colleagues.
Okay, Nisar, thank you. What a great overview. And you answered the question that I had in my head at the very end there. When are we going to see drones that somebody like me can sort of say, well, hand wavy, I want you to go do X, Y, Z, and then come back. So we'll hold our breath for that. Okay, so next, I'd like to turn the floor over to Brad Hanson at NOAA. And Brad is going to tell us about the work that he is doing with some colleagues around the San Juan Islands in the Pacific Northwest. And Brad, you ready to share your screen?
Yeah, just 1 second, because my PowerPoint for some reason just decided to disappear.
Of course it did.
Of course it did.
So I will mention while Brad is pulling that up that the work he's talking about appeared in the New York Times around the end, I want to say December 26th-ish. End of last year, there was an article that highlighted sort of at a high level some of this work and what they were finding.
Can you see my screen now?
We can. Perfect. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Well, yeah, thank you, Sheila, for putting this together, and thanks for everyone that's attending. Yeah, again, my name is Brad Hanson. I am a research scientist at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center in Seattle. Most of our work focuses on endangered southern resident killer whales. Just a little bit of background about this population. They are a fish-eating population that underwent about a 20% decline back in the mid to late 1990s and eventually ended up on the endangered species list in 2005. And since that time, they've continued to decline. And so there's a number of different potential things that we have to do when they're listed as ESA. And basically, one is develop a recovery plan that identifies risk factors and data gaps on the population. And I've listed the 4 risk factors here, and I've highlighted at the time we said contaminant burdens, because actually in the the status review, if you look at it, there's a paragraph on health, which was written up in the early 2000s. We really didn't know very much about health. So since that time, we have made a lot of progress on a variety of different aspects of things, but we also essentially do a update of the recovery plan under this program called Species in the Spotlight. So these are particular populations of endangered animals within NOAA's purview, and we develop a 5-year action plan so that we can focus on various aspects. And as you can see here, I've highlighted that we are continuing to investigate contaminants and health. And this is all part of a larger number of things that we're doing. And you can see here how contaminants and disease sort of go into this risk modeling loop that we do with other aspects, these other risk factors, such as noise and disturbance, prey availability, demographics. The population is, as you might expect, being a very small population of about 75 animals, has severe inbreeding depression, we think. So, and we think that disease is one of those things that's, playing a major role in the survivorship and fecundity of this population in terms of it being able to recover. So one of the things that we've done is partner with veterinarians, and as well as being a partnership between the government and nonprofits. And so Joe Gatos, is pictured to the left of me, I'm sitting in the center here, is a veterinarian that runs the CDOC Society based on Orcas Island. They're part of the UC Davis group. And on my right, Hendrik Nolens, and he's a veterinarian who works at the San Diego Zoo, and also had spent quite a number of years as the head vet at SeaWorld. So we've been working together for a number of years to basically start taking a look at the health of the whales and coming up with different approaches to this. And this is sort of a follow-on to some work that was done a number of years ago. There's a citation there that you see from 2017, and this was some early work that was done by some colleagues of mine. And in the photo on the right, the gentleman in the blue jacket is also a veterinarian that I've had the pleasure of working with, used to work with the Navy, Pete Schrader. And so Pete took it upon himself, starting back in about 2005, to start looking at diseases. And at the time, basically the way that we were collecting breast samples is, you can see the Petri dishes attached to a long windsurfing mast. All the rest of the windsurfing mast isn't shown. And basically the boat was then driven up next to the whales, and you wave the Petri dishes through the blow to get the information or the samples that we were looking for. And in fact, we were able to collect breast samples, and the plot here basically just shows that the microorganisms that were present in the exhaled breath were different than what was on the sea surface. So we were actually getting pathogens that were from the whales and not just from the surface layer of the water. So that's kind of where we started at on this. And then we've basically transitioned to using drones to try to do the sampling. And it's at this stage of the game, we've been working on this now since about 2019. It's a pretty basic approach. We're just mounting a sterile Petri dish on the top of off-the-shelf drone. In this case, we have the DJI Mavic Pro pictured here. And some of the considerations we gave to the mounting location was doing some image analysis of where the prop wash, went, because it was originally thought, well, you should mount since the blow is coming up and you're over the top of the well, you want to put the Petri dish there. Well, as it turns out that the vortices actually push the the droplets and whatnot from the blow up onto the top of the drone. So that's how we ended up with the Petri dish up on the top. So we basically hand launch and recover, although some changes in recent regulations within NOAA have forced us to essentially build a portable plywood helipad, if you will, that we put on top of the bow pulpit that you see. Our pilot, or in this case, James Shepard, is helping launch. Charlie's actually flying the drone at this point. And so one of the things we were really interested in looking at first is, we're flying these things basically right over the top of the whales. Do the whales notice? And after looking at all the imagery that we've taken from the drone itself, as well as we had a videographer on the boat, we found that there's two different types of killer whales that we can actually work with here in the Puget Sound area. The southern residents are the endangered population that we're really primarily interested in, but they don't show up here as much as they used to. And then there's also this marine mammal eating population called transients, and we've spent a lot of time with them. Transients don't seem to notice the drone at all. The southern residents, we think, may look up at it from time to time, but there's been no negative responses to the aircraft. So that was one of the main things that we were concerned about, because we were actually, as you can see, you're having to get relatively low to get down into the breath plume of the whales. And hopefully I can get this video to play that shows you a little bit of the drone's eye view of what it's like to try to collect breath samples. So you can see the saddle patch is that whitish area, sort of through the glare under the water, and the whale's going to come up here in a couple of seconds and take a breath, and then the drone will swoop down and try to fly through that breath plume. And I think we probably get, I think, another breath. There's the whale coming back into view. And so the whales basically are down for about 2 to 3 to 5 minutes. And then they'll come up and take a series of 3 to 4 breaths with about 20 seconds in between. So we lose track of the whales during the time when they're below the surface, but we're typically able to see them while they're taking sort of these inter deep dive or long dive surface, short dives that they're going. I think we get one more breath. Here we go. Okay. So some of the challenges that we found here over the last few years are, one, consistently positioning the UAS into the breath plume. And the second is sample retention post-collection. And you can just see here, this is probably ideal conditions where you can see the whale's dorsal fin just sort of breaking the surface, and you can see the breath plume, and then you can see the drone sort of on the left, middle edge. But trying to position it in the breath plume is really challenging. We have 2 really high-skilled pilots that we work with, but they still struggle to try to keep track of the drone relative to the moving boat and the moving whales. And this can burn a lot of flight time. What's the solution? Perhaps additional practice opportunities, not, there's just a lot of moving parts. One of the main issues to this is judging distance on the water during close approach is extremely difficult. And that's because that there's really limited reference points, and that the few that do exist, i.e. the whales, are always moving or disappearing. And then secondly, the breath plume itself remains stationary or drifts with the wind. And of course, then there's current and as well as wind direction further confound the use of the reference points. While we're trying to essentially position the boat relative to the whales, so that the pilots can judge where where the whales are going to come up next and how to actually get into the plume. And some of our thoughts in our discussions about how to overcome this, might be the use of a 3D camera or sensors with a spectrum that would better display the breath plume. The sample retention post-collection problem is that, as I mentioned, the Petri dish is located on the top. While the rotors tend to concentrate the spray up onto the top and the vortices put it onto the Petri dish, they also act as fans to evaporate the sample. And we found that this can be even further exacerbated if it's sunny out, because by the time you get the sample, we've found that, you know, we can sometimes see clearly that we get into the breath plume, but by the time we get back, get the aircraft landed on the platform, all that sort of stuff, the sample is evaporated. And, you know, this retention is confounded by that the killer whales have relatively small blow volume compared to, you know, going out and doing like humpbacks. You know, that's, a lot of people do that. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, their breath plumes like 20 some feet high. And as I mentioned, trying to get into that breath plume, you know, in an area where there's enough volume to be able to collect samples is really, really challenging. And as I just mentioned, part of the problem is that, you know, the whales are relatively infrequently occur at the surface. You know, about every 2 to 5 minutes, they'll surface from a deep dive. So one of the problems you have to do is you have to relocate and reposition following that first surfacing. So you've sort of lost that first surfacing. We're trying to parallel the whales based on dead reckoning in the boat, you know, matching course and speed. So I've essentially got one eye on the GPS, you know, tracking the course that they were using and the speed. And then when they do come up, we have to reorient the boat as well as the drone. And then you've got about 3 to 4 breaths near the surface, as I mentioned, with about 20 seconds in between. And the whales are only on the surface for about a second to breathe. And so one of the solutions that we've talked about was to develop a device that would open and close to preserve that sample. And so we were actually really fortunate to be able to work with a group of engineering students at the University of Washington through the Global Innovation Exchange Program. And they developed a prototype clamshell device that could be remotely opened and closed. And it you know, worked great, you know, as in the prototype stage, but we haven't had any ability to test this in the field. I mean, in the prototype testing, one of the things that we noticed was that it does appear to impact flight performance from the standpoint that it, as you might expect, I mean, they did a great job streamlining this thing, but as you can see, it sort of acts as a wing, and that is impacting the ability of the aircraft to be able to respond rapidly to, as you saw in the video, you know, zipping into the plume of the breath plume of the whales. So this is something that, you know, we're interested in trying to continue to pursue, but you know, we just haven't had the manpower and resources to really move past sort of the prototype stage. And I just wanted to wrap up by acknowledging the numerous collaborators, partners, and volunteers outside of NOAA that have worked on this so far. And we've received funding through a number of different sources that have helped support CDOC Society as well as the San Diego Zoo. And I will leave it for questions. And I guess we're going to hold those for a bit, and I will stop sharing. And
okay, great, Brad. Thank you. Very cool. Okay, so lastly, we have Debbie Saunders. So Debbie, you were here and now you're off screen. Yes, okay.
Thank you. Really fabulous to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm just blown away by all the things I've heard this morning, and I can already see so much collaboration that could happen between all of us here today. Let me just share my screen. So off to a really different application now, really digging into the more terrestrial forms of wildlife and the use of drones. And with wildlife drones, we have specialized in building our own radio telemetry sensors, and so I'm going to talk a bit about the evolution of those sensors over time, as well as the techniques that are used in our everyday work to help inform people who are making decisions about how to better manage or assess the impacts of our actions on wildlife. So this is our evolution. Started back in 2011, and like Nisar said, there was really not that many options around in the early days. I think it was even earlier than this, but it was a very small platform, and Ascending Technologies Falcon 8, really short flight time, really limited lift capability, etc. And so this is where we began our journey to see whether it was even possible to be able to track the tiny tags that researchers put on wildlife all around the world. These are VHF radio transmitters, and we really wanted to listen for these low power tags in what is an incredibly noisy world. We didn't know if it was even possible from a drone, and so we embarked on this journey to be able to shed light on my own research questions, which was looking at small migratory birds, which we were unable to track in any other way. So we started off with a research project over 3-4 years, and then we proved it was possible, and we started getting all these inquiries from all over the world with all these people who are out there tracking animals by hand, like you see in the documentaries with their arm up in the air, listening for the beep, beep of the tag and walking around trying to localize where that signal is coming from, and having immense troubles typically and losing animals in the process. And so when we revealed that there was so much interest, we started exploring, well, how can we translate what was this prototype? And it's awesome to see those other prototypes that are out there, because that's where it all begins. It's really hard to support your career, I found, in academia, doing prototypes of tech, because you can't necessarily publish as much as you would like because they want a polished product, etc. Anyway, so I then finished up with that project. We had no more funding. I set off on a journey to find people who are willing to work for free and were passionate in this space. Came up with our own initial prototypes, which addressed all the weaknesses with the original version, and progressively were able to build it up into a product that anybody can use. And now we've really miniaturized this as well. And we've shifted from our original platform, which was the DJI Matrice 210. We still use that to this day, and a lot of our clients, this is the platform that they use. But as drone manufacturers have changed how they're manufacturing the drones, they basically emit a lot more VHF noise than they used to. They're more powerful, they can fly for longer, which is what all pilots want. But if you are listening in the VHF band for a low power tag, this causes problems if it's not properly shielded. And so we are no longer able to use the DJI drones. So there's the more recent models and the Matrice series, for example, and the smaller drones don't have the capability of carrying the payload that we need to put on it. So we're really grateful that we're able to partner up with Free Fly Systems based in Washington State. They have a beautiful platform of the same sort of size and caliber as the Matrice called the Astro. And it's been a real delight to work with that team there, doing the initial R&D and being able to adapt what we had for the Matrice onto the Free Fly Systems platform. So that's on the radio telemetry side. We also provide thermal imaging services. We predominantly do this here in Australia, but it's something that we're exploring to potentially also expand into in the US, because it's actually become quite a major part of our business. And so with this particular technology, we are just using off-the-shelf sensors. We're not reinventing anything here, but what we are doing is developing the techniques, and we are the leaders in our country, perhaps in the world, in some of this thermal imaging of wildlife and developing the methods and techniques. And I'll be able to share some examples with you of what that looks like. We started with koalas, which, big fat animal up a tree that you think would be easy to find, but they're actually incredibly difficult to find in the forest, and how we've evolved that over time. But just to give you a sense of like the breadth of the different sectors that are using these types of technologies that we either provide services for, or they purchase our telemetry sensor and actually go and do the tracking of the animals themselves. So we have natural resources managers, it might be catchment managers, we have biodiversity credits. That's an increasing aspect where people are wanting to protect areas and then get credits for doing so, and being able to demonstrate what assets they have on the land. And you have your standard sort of impact assessment across the infrastructure, extractive industries, but then also offsets and stewardship sites, and environmental conservation sites, just understanding what are the threatened species and invasive species on my land, as well as the renewable energy sector. So it's really quite broad and more widely applicable than perhaps people realize, and how much all these different elements touch on all of our lives and things that we do. To just show you what that really looks like in terms of the different types of data that come out of these using these different sensors. On the left, we have the radio telemetry data. So we have a flight path, wherever the drone is flown, wherever we pick up a signal, it lights up green, so we can see that it's detected an animal. You can tell exactly which frequency tags have been detected at every point. And using rotations, we can actually get bearings and get locations of animals without going anywhere near them. And so it's really, we can actually do this from quite a distance away. And so what was originally seen as drones are an issue for wildlife, with the advancement of sensors, we can do more and more from further and further away. And we're actually enabling people now to do research they couldn't do before on the ground, because by walking close to where the animals were was actually disturbing them. And now you can get this data without having to do that. So we get real-time information from the drone back to a base station laptop. It's just radio signal data, and then on the base station, all the algorithms do the signal processing in real time and are able to localize up to 40 of these tags simultaneously, which is a bit of a game changer, because otherwise people are looking for one tag at a time. And gives you the points on the map. So if people need to go and do some observations or recatch the animals or do anything like that, check on the status of the health of that animal, they can easily do that. With the thermal survey data, we are doing a really different type of survey, more of your standard drone mapping kind of a project, where you have these sort of predetermined flight lines that you want to follow. But what we do is actually still fly it manually. But when we find a target species, we have to collect the data, as much data as possible, to identify it down to species level. And so you therefore end up with all these points across the map. In this case, it's greater gliders, which are an endangered species, but in very high density at this site. It was amazing. But we can also identify other features. So we can monitor and count populations as a whole that aren't tagged. But if you want to actually find some animals to tag them, you can use the thermal imaging to find them and catch them. And then you can actually track individual movements as well. So you go from whole populations all the way down to specific movements of individuals. Just to give you some examples, in the US, the Washington State Department of Ag has our technology with the aim of being able to track the giant hornets that are beginning to turn up in the US and are a great threat to the food supply chain there. And so they are going to be tracking the hornets. Hopefully this season they will be able to find some animals to be able to track to their nests, so that they can then eradicate those nests. And this is by far the smallest animal that's been tracked that will be tracked using our technology. And other projects in the US as well. The USDA has been using this technology, and it was one of the first projects where they were tracking both invasive and native species at the same time. So they're really opening up new opportunities to be able to look at interactions between different species, whereas previously it was so hard to track one species that nobody was really doing this type of work. And then we have snakes, which this is a project here in Australia, but these types of species are incredibly difficult to track by hand. They are on the ground under rocks, and they're small, and so they're small transmitters in really difficult places. So being on the ground and tracking them is not only dangerous here in Australia, but also you just can't pick them up from very far away. So whenever they go out and they lose their animals, where they give us a call and we go out, and within a single flight, we find what they've been looking for 1 or 2 weeks. So it really can be a massive game changer in terms of efficiencies and being able to collect the data you need. In this instance, they're looking at the human-wildlife conflict area between urban areas that are adjacent to reserves. Another example, just showing the scale at which drones enable operations to work across. These are bettongs. Sorry, they're hair wallabies, not bettongs. They're tiny kangaroo essentially, and they're on these remote San Juan Islands, and the invasive species had wiped out all native animals on this island. They've removed the invasive species and reintroduced these, and they need to track them to understand their survival. With handheld telemetry, this is the sort of coverage, the view shed of what they're able to cover on the ground, and from exactly the same locations on the ground, but using the drone, you can get over 11 times more coverage from the same locations. And so this is sand dune country with very little road, and so walking in here was just insane. I've actually been to this island and I was helping with this research, and yeah, it's a real game changer for them. So you can see there's just a plethora of different species and different ecosystems, from wetlands to tall forests, through to tropical rainforests for pangolins in Vietnam, and really into kakapo down in New Zealand. So this technology really is applicable across all ecosystems. We haven't flown in Antarctica. Unfortunately, I'll have to talk to Nisar and see if we can get some collaboration happening there. But yeah, we have gone from alpine areas right through to deserts with this technology being used. I'm probably pushing it for time, so I'll just flick through. There's some very quick videos here just to show you just how much we've advanced. So koalas were the only thing we could really survey for up until the last year or two that we could actually get identification. You can see the thermal imaging, little tiny hotspots, which then become challenging to identify. But with the inclusion of a spotlight as well, we're able to completely turn that game around. So here is some footage of us doing thermal surveys of a koala. So you can see it's just kind of like a white lump in the tree, but as soon as you flick on the spotlight, you can immediately see that there is this animal sitting there, and you can actually watch their natural behavior and their foraging. And that's a rather large animal, and that's helpful. This is another species which is called the greater glider. This is a critically endangered species now, and there is very contentious issue here in Australia because there's continuous logging of their habitat, and they need old growth habitat, and they're really hard to find. But with the drone, we can get imagery like this, which is just undeniable that there are many of these animals out there, and that they really need to improve their survey efforts. We're going smaller again. The squirrel glider is not much bigger than the size of your hand, and we're able to actually observe their natural behavior, how they're navigating through this old growth woodland, and you can see, capture this sort of stuff that just nobody's really seen this before. But then being able to take from that thermal imaging to be able to zoom in and get a high resolution shot of that animal to be able to identify it to species is really different. And this is the tiniest one. So if you're thinking about an animal the size of your thumb, this is what we have here running around, and there's an owl that came in and predated that animal as we were, just observing without any spotlight. When we zoomed in on these tiny animals, this is what we're finding. This is an eastern pygmy possum. It's a tiny little possum the size of your thumb in a hollow at the top of a tree. And so this is the kind of detail that we can now get even on the tiniest species and some of the most rare species in the landscape. And we can also capture their features of the habitat. So sometimes there are denning sites that are really crucial for management. Looking at invasive species at the same time as being able to look at endangered species is a real game changer. So we can help people on the ground find them more efficiently and be able to control them more efficiently. And this is our vision for what we see. And I can really see a lot of parallels here with what Nisar was talking about and the work that Brad's doing in just being able to get more sensors on a single platform. I'm definitely going to look into what you're using in your VTOL system over there, because that's exactly what we want to do, embed additional sensors into one platform, be able to monitor water sources, track invasive species, upload data from ground sensors, have autonomous landing and launching, real-time data analytics, so land managers can go out and do the things that are meaningful but have the ground data or the baseline data on which to make their decisions. Thank you. And I'll introduce Paul, who's also on the call here, if anyone wants to find out more, that you can always subscribe here and or contact us. We'd love to hear about even more applications. We're always keen to find out about new ideas. Thank you.
Okay, Debbie, thank you. Just spectacular, spectacular applications there. So I'd like to, we have a couple minutes left. The webinar does go until 1/4 after, but I recognize that a lot of people time out at the hour. So I'd like to open things up for questions. For those of you in the audience, please feel free to put any questions that you have in the Q&A window, and we'll get that to the panel. And so first question, and I'll just direct this, I guess, to everybody, and you guys can decide. What is the longest time that a rotary drone can fly? I assume that this is important for scaling. So Nisar and Debbie, you gave us both sort of a history of drones. How have things emerged?
It really depends on the kind of power plant. I guess if you're going by battery, usually max I've seen is something like on the order of 20 something minutes, depending on the payload and the size of the drone itself and how many rotors and engine power. So the typical off the shelf like DJI Mavic, I don't know, Debbie, what the latest numbers are, but they can go for a while because they don't have a huge payload. Their batteries are pretty decent now. They've engineered them quite well. So, but as you mentioned, your typical off-the-shelf hobby drone or one that you can just, build yourself, at least the ones my students are playing with, they tend to have a flight time between 15 to 20 minutes if they're using LiPos. So, but DJIs, I
I'll
guess,
just
could go
jump
for
in there with the latest Mavic, not Mavic, sorry, Matrice platforms, for example. They are 30 to 40 minutes now. So yeah, like they've literally doubled it in more recent times. But as I mentioned, the way they manufacture those to get that extra flight time means that for some applications, it doesn't really work. But that's where I'm really excited about that transition to VTOL, where you have the vertical takeoff and land, but really long time in the air. I think it's going to be a real game changer for so many applications.
Yeah, the wing adds a lot of endurance. So going with fixed wing. So that's why in the drone, the storm chasing work, they rely on fixed wing primarily because they have to be up there for possibly an hour or more. So they could do it with some drones if they launch them at the right time, but it's also, there's some stability issues with that too. So yeah.
Okay, so the next question we have is from Canada. And the question is, do you consider low Earth orbit satellites to be a potential resource in what you're doing?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think we all need to fill all the gaps, I guess, like I think there's so many different forms that data can come in, and whether it's, high level satellites or low level, and then filling that gap with drones where there isn't the resolution that is required. I think there's immense capability to as that all continues to advance, to tap into that wherever possible. For all of the work that we do, that's all visual data, and it doesn't provide what we need, and so drones will always have a role to add into that. But what that can do is give you information, more high resolution information about the habitats, potentially about the structures of those habitats as well. And so I feel like there's a real nice complementary nature to all of this data that can be remotely sensed to different degrees.
Brad, do you want to add anything?
No, we're actually just recently, we're approached to start trying to use some of this imagery from these low altitude satellites to, just look for whales. And so I think that there's an interesting potential nexus for that, because one of the things that we're challenged with is just that the whales that we work with have moved their distribution and seasonal occurrence patterns to the outer coast. And that's an area that is very challenging to work in. So we're still trying to figure out how do we get out there. And so a combination perhaps of satellite, reconnaissance coupled with, beyond visual line of sight drones could basically help us get the information that we're looking for.
Okay, so another question about flying. When flying in tough terrains with a lot of trees, do you use an altimeter? And Brad, I guess this is relevant to you too. You mentioned that it's hard to sort of get a bearing as to where things are when you're out on the water. And how do the drones handle tree canopy detection, or maybe for that matter, anything else that is potentially in the area?
So from our perspective, yeah, most of our flying is in this forested landscape, and so and it is one of the more challenging landscapes for drones, because you need, at the moment with our operations, we need to be able to see it. At night time, the advantage is you can actually see it quite a long way through the canopy a lot of the time, because when it's dark and you've got these bright lights on the drone, you can actually see it quite some way. But we fly manually, especially at night. And so this is where our pilot skill is the key. It takes a lot of skill to get good at flying in forest, like flying those patterns on a ridge in a gully and everything else, and being able to just have the awareness. So you're actually using the thermal sensor. They get good at knowing like what it looks like when you're close and what it looks like when you're at certain different altitudes above the canopy. It's really important to always do reconnaissance before you go out, because otherwise one emergent tree can stop your operations. But the pilot's skill in navigating using the thermal imagery that they're seeing, I mean, they're actually looking down as well, so more than looking ahead necessarily. So obviously they can change the angle of the camera to get a bit of a feeling for it. But we don't rely on the drone, but we rely on the pilot in our current operations. Having said that, just today I'm going to go out and even just like with a little Mavic and do some mapping. And there are sensors on the drones now that can do terrain following, and there's also digital elevation models that you can import in, like, super easy these days. How much you can rely on it, I think, depends on how accurate that data is that you're using to do the flying. And so I think you always need to allow a bit of extra error. So I'm actually going to go out and test some of this and using the two different, like the elevation models and the sensors, and just see which one really gives us the performance that we need in terms of mapping the vegetation side of things. It's not something we've actually done. I know a lot of people do this, so it's not like we're reinventing anything here, but I just want myself to get really familiar with it, because we have other work that we're doing where we're trying to empower people on the ground who may not be tech savvy and who might be a farmer or what have you, to actually just get some off the shelf tech and be able to map out the natural parts of their land and monitor them over time. And so I want to do that myself to get that experience. And there's some pretty smart little drones out there now that are quite affordable, that have these really great sensors. So I'm probably not the right person to actually ask about, how good those sensors are myself, but our pilots do a fair bit of that. And I think they're always advancing. So there's great scope there.
Nisar, do you want to make some comments on?
Yeah, so like we
Sensor-
we do a lot of testing in our aerospace backyard, and my student showed me with the DJI Mavic he's using for the search and rescue stuff that it can actually stop short of our crashing into our building because it has this geofencing sort of capability now. But a lot of that relies on GPS. And so that's one of the challenges for navigating with drones, is that they're pretty heavily reliant on using inertial measurement units, so accelerometers and gyros and GPS. And it's like peanut butter and jelly for an aerospace engineer. They perfectly complement each other. They kind of work together really well. But when you lose GPS, then suddenly you're sort of dead reckoning, and you're hoping that your altimeter and compass are telling you the right answers. Otherwise, you're going to start hitting stuff really soon. So there's a lot of work now on using cameras and vision sensors to try and supplement that. When you're flying under a forest canopy, that's another challenging environment for getting GPS signals, for example, right? So that's hopefully the next generation of drones will be able to do things with GPUs and computer vision to be able to navigate the way pilots do, right? So that's sort of a next around the corner kind of thing that I think is coming down the pipe.
Yeah. I think but a lot of this is around vision. And so as soon as you work at night, most of it doesn't work. And so you really do need to, at the moment, have that capability. But it would be amazing to, not be so reliant on vision and be able to be even smarter as we go, and build in the buffers that you need to be able to fly safely without having to rely on human judgment in that instance. So, yeah, it's exciting.
So maybe with the observations on vision, I will wrap up by, I think, mentioning what I see as a open opportunity in terms of tech that is very much needed, has been needed for a long time, and I think continues to be needed. Debbie, I know that you mentioned that you're often tracking animals that have been tagged. And of course, in that application, the bottleneck is the tag, and you can't track an animal using that technology if they haven't been tagged. Brad, similarly, you're looking for these whales that, if they could tell us where they were, with some type of beacon, either passive or active, then that obviously would make being able to intercept their blow much easier. And of course, here in Boston on the East Coast, we have a huge problem with the right whale population that keeps getting run over by boats in the Northeast. And similarly, they're not calling up the ships saying, hey, I'm here, can you go around me? An easy way to tag animals en masse that is, straightforward, inexpensive, works for the species appropriately. This is a huge open need, I think, in conservation. Years and years ago, when I was at Draper working on this problem, we were approached by some folks who were dealing with elephants. And one of the things we thought about was there something that we could put out that the elephants would eat, not that they could necessarily be tracked as they moved, but that as that material exited them, there would be a trail of where they had gone. Now, obviously that doesn't work for whales, but that's one way to think about sort of creative tagging of animals. So I would perhaps leave our audience with questions around thinking about, how can we, in an ecologically friendly way, in an animal friendly way, develop sensors and the complementary sensing technology that now we have the opportunity to deploy on drones in a way that was not possible 10 years ago, toward really getting the integrated data that the conservation folks, that the animal health folks, that the ecology folks really need in order to allow us to be better stewards of the planet. So with that, I would like to thank very, very much our panel, who was very gracious in accommodating our cross-time zone, cross-continental timing on this. Thank you so much for your very, very well put together talks with beautiful videos and just really, really neat applications. And for those of you that would like to go back and hear something, stay tuned, and this will appear on our YouTube channel with everything else. So thanks very much, everybody. Have a great spring.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Right.
See you.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.